Hello everyone. So this session, the Societies of Asia, will give you a broad survey of the societies of Asia and share and tell you the differences among them and some similarities among them. The similarities include particularly their emphasis on hierarchical ranking. We talked a lot about the Indian caste system, and also we will compare it with the East Asia social orders. Then I will talk about the family, sexual behavior, and the status of women in the societies of Asia. As is still true today to a large extent, Asian societies have shown a remarkable similarity in their emphasis on hierarchical status grouping based primarily on age, gender, occupation, or social role. They also stressed and still stress the subordination of individual interest to the common interest of the group, like the family, village, caste, or other occupational unit. Individuals advanced or lost status as members of groups as the groups advanced, prospered or declined, or as the individuals grow older. Many of the achievements of the Asian past are attributable to this acceptance of the need to work together in pursuit of common goals. So they were discouraged from trying to operate on their own, and certainly from attempting to challenge, subvert, get around, or change the group-oriented social system. So the system rewarded those who worked within it and provided both material and emotional security. In fact, there were few attempts to change. Those who tried to rock the boat or to avoid behaving like team players were often seen as troublemakers or even dangerous radicals, threatening threatening the group interest and welfare, or even the entire social order. So individualism and individual expression, which are highly valued in the modern West, were seen as antisocial, disruptive, selfish, and destructive of the group interest. But there are some exceptions. We talked about the Hindu sadhus, which is the holy man who was outside the caste system. It also includes they also include Buddhist hermits, Taoist eccentrics, Sufi mystics, etc. Given the relative stability and the impressive accomplishments of Asian societies, it must be acknowledged that their social systems and values worked well, however different they were from modern West norms. As the traditional Chinese proverb, revived by the communist government after 1949, put it, quote, "When there is water in the big river, the little streams will be full also," unquote. In other words, individuals benefited best from devoting themselves to strengthening the group enterprise, which in turn rewarded them. The alternative, having people follow their own inclinations or ambitions, was seen as leading to disorder or even chaos, considered the greatest of all catastrophes and one from which everyone suffered. Put another way, it is said that Asian societies operated on the principle that the acknowledgement of limits leads to happiness. And modern Western ideas of freedom had little place in Asian societies until recently. The longevity of Asian social systems suggests that they delivered rewards and satisfaction to most people most of the time. When political orders collapsed in the past or when new rulers took over, the traditional values and social systems were usually reasserted, and basic change in those respects was seldom attempted. The authority of those with superior status, including family heads and elders, was seldom questioned, still less defied. People were supposed to follow their directions, a pattern still widely observable in contemporary Asia. This heritage continues to make Asian versions of what we call democracy distinctive, at least in its social forms, and different from the patterns and attitudes of the modern West. The Asian social systems particularly disadvantaged women, which I will talk about it later. Okay, now let's see the social hierarchies in India. Well, so this part we emphasize again and again. So I mentioned before that the caste system was mainly from Hinduism. Yes, it has some religious elements, but it's also a social practice. So caste was decreed by birth and affected nearly all South Asians, including Pakistan, India, Nepal, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. Caste evolved as a social cultural rather than religious practice, but with some religious concepts woven in. It is still practiced by South Asian Muslims, Christians, and Buddhists. Compared to China, no strong central. India's religious diversity after the forcible advent of Islam and its great linguistic variety made the cultural scene still more diverse, or even confused and conflicted. Caste provided a system of social organization that was otherwise largely lacking and gave each individual a sense of belonging in the form of membership in a larger group beyond the basic nexus of the family. Caste operated also as a mutual benefit society because it can help caste members who were in material trouble settling disputes. It can also help settle disputes and work as a common interest group on behalf of the welfare of all members. This system can also upgrade the caste's relative status, helping arranging marriage partners and a response to other basic needs. But caste distinctions seem not to have been observed rigidly until relatively late in Indian history. Escape from caste was always possible through religious devotion. Again, underlining caste's non-religious nature. The holy man was, regardless of his early origins, supposed to be beyond caste and honored by all. Caste has remained a highly flexible system, although individuals are born into a given jati or group by sustained group effort, any jati might raise its status, often by adopting the religious, dietary, and other practices of higher status groups and by asserting higher status. So this process is called Sanskritization. So this term is from the use of Sanskrit rituals associated with the Brahmins. In addition, the power of group action can be a potent weapon, especially in politics. This is particularly characteristic of Asian societies where the individual is important primarily as a member of a group, whether family, clan, caste, or regional or linguistic division. Okay, now let's look at the social hierarchy in East Asia. First, I have to talk about the China's social hierarchy because this pattern was spread to Japan, Korea, and Vietnam. So China's social political order was the original model for the rest of East Asia, and China remains overwhelmingly its largest and most populous unit. In China during the imperial era, power, responsibility, and status formed a pyramidal structure like this. So the emperor was at the top as a truly absolute monarch. Below him were appointed officials in a series of grades, including councillors, provincial governors, and generals, down to the district magistrates in counties, all of whom eventually were selected from the ranks of the scholar gentry who had passed the third level of the imperial examinations. But this was not merely a political pyramid, and it did not act alone. The emperor and his officials had as their highest duty the setting of a good example of virtuous conduct. They were seen and saw themselves as fathers to the people, because the family was the basis of social order. In theory, if the emperor and his officials behaved properly and responsibly, others in the social hierarchy would do so as well. So this concept also relates to the concept, the mandate of heaven. In practice, social order, or in Confucian parlance, the great harmony was preserved primarily by the family system. This operated in much the same way in the rest of Asia. The family was the state in microcosm. Younger people deferred to their elders, as did wives to their husbands and social inferiors to the superiors. This was the Confucian formula for happiness and social harmony, which spread with the rest of Confucianism to Korea, Vietnam, and Japan. But it was in most respects paralleled by Indian social mores. For all Asians, age was equated with wisdom and authority. Okay, now let's look at the basic unit of each Asian society. So Southeast Asia was an exception. The paternalistic family was a hierarchical structure in which group welfare took precedence over individual preferences. The father was like a little emperor, not only with absolute power, but also with absolute responsibility. Filial obedience was the cardinal Asian virtues. Loyalty and obligation to parents and elders was rigid and inflexible. But it produced a tight-knit unit. In family relations, age was the major determinant. 3 generations commonly lived under one roof, and the grandfather was thus the dominant figure, although his place might be taken after his death by his widow. Youngest sons were subject to their older brothers, wives and sisters to their husbands and brothers, and all to the eldest male. Family continuity is extremely important. Because the oldest surviving son had the responsibility in all of the Asian cultures to conduct funeral services to his parents, and annual rituals thereafter, theoretically forever, because this kind of rituals ensure the well-being of the departed spirits and their continued help from the hereafter. A few Asians questioned the family hierarchy. The family operated as a collective entirety. Each member was both socially and legally responsible for the behavior of all other members. Collective responsibility, family pride, and the shame of family disgrace are still credited for the relatively low rate of crime in much of Asia. Government from higher levels was far less necessary. That's why we call Asian societies self-regulating, and to a very large extent that was true. The price of this was the sacrifice of individual initiative, independence, and self-fulfillment, so prized by the modern West and now increasingly attractive in many parts of modern Asia. Okay, so look at the picture. So this is a very typical expression of the filial piety from one generation to another generation. The youngest son is helping his mom combing her hairs. So the wives is helping her mother-in-law, and the filial son is washing feet for his mother. Now let's look at the marriage system. Marriage were almost always arranged by agreement between the two families concerned, which is very convenient. You don't have to worry about, you cannot find the other half of your life. Dowries were commonly part of the marriage contract outside Southeast Asia, especially in India. In Southeast Asia, the male's family commonly paid a bride price. Part of a woman's dowry, again, especially in India, was often in the form of jewelry that remained her own, because the jewelry could serve as a kind of security against hard times. The average age at marriage was lower until well into the 20th century than in the medieval or early modern West. So the average age at marriage were approximately 21 for males and 17 for females in China, 16 for males and 14 for females in India, and 20 for males and 16 for females in Japan and Southeast Asia. Marriage was seen by all as a contract between families for the furthering of their interests. Virtually all marriages were arranged by the families. So usually this process is through a go-between. Go-betweens were often older widows who surveyed the assortment of suitable partners in the area. They made it their business to keep informed, to investigate the characters of prospective partners and their family circumstances, and to do at least the preliminary negotiation. The go-betweens would charge a small fee. So the small fee is the go-between's primary income. Bride and groom had usually not met before their wedding. Sometimes they might be allowed to express preferences, although these might be overruled in the family interest. Compatibility was rarely considered, and love marriages were extremely rare, although affection might grow in time. So you just watched the opera, the free love between the girl and the young man. Actually, was very rare among ordinary people. Divorce was rare, but it is very difficult, but still possible. Remarriage was even more difficult, if not impossible, and that knowledge probably helped people try harder to make their marriages work. People were trained to put individual wants second to family interest. There is abundant evidence from biographies, memoirs, popular literature, and legal records that most marriages were successful within these terms, and that husbands and wives valued and even loved one another and worked together in the family unit to reproduce the dominant social pattern. Here is a picture of a bride in Tsunokakushi and Shiramoku at Tokyo Meiji Shrine. So these two terms means the white hat style, particularly for bride. So after marriage system, let's pay attention to the child rearing. Given the pressing need for sons, boys were clearly favored, but children in general welcomed and loved as much fuss was made over them. But in China, particularly among the rural poor people, when people could not survive, the baby girls probably be killed or abandoned or sold to other people for to survive. Girls were trained early to accept their lower place in the hierarchy of the family and of the larger society, and there seems to have been little or no possibility of rebellion. Also, the happy early childhood golden age did not last for a long time, because usually girls were trained to be responsible for housework in a very early age. And also in China, usually at the age of 5 to 7, they would accept foot binding, which is a very painful process. So generally, girls were not happy in Asian societies. However, boys were not afraid of Operation 2 because they had to obey to their fathers, older brothers, and other male relatives. In any case, Western observers find that the Asian adult male, especially an oldest son, remains heavily dependent on others throughout his life. He not only tends readily to accept the hierarchy of society and his place in it, but also assumes that people will take care of him especially his wife, society in general, his superiors, his friends, and so on. This extreme dependency has been most remarked on in Japanese and Indian adult males. So this slide is about sexuality in Asian societies. Asian women were usually expected to be modest and chaste. Upper-class women seldom appeared in public, and any open display of affection with their husbands were taboo, as it still tends to be. At the same time, the elite Asian cultures are famous for their erotic literature and art, and for the development of a courtesan tradition. Courtesans were trained performers. They did not always offer sexual services, in addition to singing and dancing at male gatherings. So we know the tradition of geisha in Japan. This is a picture of a modern geisha. And also in China, the Xing girl or flower boat women are well known. So this is a picture of upper class Xing girl in Shanghai in the 19th century. So pay attention to her tiny feet. It is a symbol of beauty at that time. So we also know the cult of ritual sex among Indian temple priestesses and the orgies of tantric Buddhism. So this is a sculpture of sex between a priest and a priestess. And this is also a sculpture of sex behavior in Buddhism, tantric Buddhism. But we have to realize that the tradition of courtesan was only for male elites' pleasures. It was far beyond the experience of most people. For the great mass of the population, sex was a brief and often furtive pleasure after dark. Because most people lived close together, and most households included 3 generations, sharing at most 2 small rooms. Privacy was non-existent, and one was almost never out of sight or sound of other people. Another thing about sexual behavior in Asia is homosexuality were acceptable before the modern era. So, in most parts of Asia, cultural life outside of the family generally provide opportunities for elite men to find male sexual partners. Sometimes the sexual partners were trained as female impersonators. Men who were attracted to other men were still expected to marry the women their families chose and have children to carry on the family line. For the wives, they were strictly forbidden to commit adultery and were often very harshly punished for it, while male sexual infidelity was often tolerated. In practice, philandering and visits to Xing girls or other prostitutes was largely limited to the elite, because the elite could afford such indulgences and also could afford additional wives and concubines. Since this is my specialty, I will talk more about the status of women in Asia. Although many women might have been powers within their families, their role in general was highly subordinate. There is no question that there was a male dominated world, and that their chief claim to status was as breeders of sons. Females were subject first to their fathers and brothers, then to their husbands, and to their husbands' male relatives. Most Asian widows, again, so most Asian widows, except a part of Southeast and parts of South India, was not supposed to remarry or even to have male friends, although in the lower classes, necessity could overcome the social stigma, especially if a widow was still young and childless. Okay, now I'm going to talk about foot binding in China. Foot binding in China, apparently first practiced by the elite in the Song dynasty, around the 10th century to the Qing dynasty, even until early 20th century. So the foot binding in China was an example of the limitations imposed on women in Asia. The custom spread in later centuries and became widely accepted, particularly during the Qing dynasty. This is a very painful this is a very painful process. But it is also a passage if a Chinese girl wanted to obtain a good husband. The binding fate also is called the lily fate, or the 3-inch golden lattice. So 3-inch basically is the ideal size. The binding fate came to be praised as a sexual object, and much was written about its erotic charms. While the girls were still young and their bones were supple, their feet were tightly wrapped and prevented from growing, or they were distorted until the arch was broken and the toes bent under. So look at these pictures. Many women with especially small feet were effectively crippled and could walk only in a painful hobble. They became mere playthings for men, especially for the well-to-do, and their freedom of action was further limited. Other women, after the first few painful years, found that they could move about relatively freely. The size of a woman's foot was often closely linked to her class status, because poor women could not afford. They spent far too much time working, even outside in the fields, to be able to devote the time required to produce an exceptionally tiny foot. Westerners have long criticized the foot binding, in many cases for good reasons. Look at this picture. Actually, this is an X-ray photo taken by a Western medical missionary. But the custom meant many things to the Chinese women. First, according to some male scholars, the process was one way that a Chinese mother conveyed to her daughter the limitations of female life. Foot binding was also perceived by Chinese as a particularly suitable manifestation of beauty in a Confucian world, because it not only required active self-sacrifice and effort on the part of a young girl, but also meant that beauty was available to any girl, no matter her appearance or class. It also meant that women were perceived as agents of their own oppression in a patriarchal society. Recent research also questions the long-standing criticism of foot binding as torture or mutilation and concludes that foot binding was not considered mutilation in China because it required molding or shaping the foot, not cutting it. Over time, the bound foot became an object of great pride among many Chinese women and their men, and it was seen as a symbol of Han civilization. So it is particular for Han people, not the minority people, like the Manchus or the nomadic people. Binding feet was a symbol to differentiate from the civilized Han people, contrasted to the barbarians. Despite the appeal of many aspects of Chinese thought and culture, foot binding remained a uniquely Han Chinese custom, and many minority peoples in China did not bind their feet. The custom seems incomprehensible today, although male admiration of small female feet is certainly not confined to China. As in the West, in hard times, female infants were sometimes killed at or soon after birth, so that the rest of the family could survive. Female babies were also sold as servants or potential concubines. The selling of children seems especially heartless, but such a girl might have a better life as a slave servant or concubine in a wealthy household than starving to death with her own family. So women were rarely permitted any formal education. They could not go to school with boys. But many girls in the elite classes acquired education. They were primarily instructed by their mothers and mothers-in-law in how to be good wives, mothers, and daughters-in-law. Power within the family brought women rewards that were especially important in this family-centered society. Their key role in ensuring family continuity brought much satisfaction. But there are still some powerful women. For example, some women achieved public prominence as writers, reigning empresses and powers behind the throne as imperial consorts or concubines. In India, China, and Southeast Asia, a few women became rulers in their own right, but only in India could one find women who were brilliant generals and cavalry fighters. Southeast Asia has traditionally been freer of sex discrimination than India, China, Korea, and Japan. Most of its regional cultures included some matrilocal marriage, female control and inheritance of property, and female dominance within the family. Property usually descended through the female line, and children often carried their mother's family name. Of course, there were women of strong character, as many as men, and many outside Southeast Asia did become dominant within their husbands' families. Publicly, they were supposed to behave submissively, but inside the household, it was often different, especially for older women who had produced grown sons or whose husbands were weaker people. At last, let's talk about the Muslim women in Asia. In the Islamic areas, mainly North and Northwest India, in today's Pakistan and Bangladesh, women were discouraged from participating in activities outside the home by the conviction that females should be scheduled as well as veiled. The latter practice was also an obvious practical way of enforcing anonymity on them when they did appear in public. Women who engaged in trade or educational pursuits were rare exceptions outside Southeast Asia. The orthodox Muslim restrictions on women did not apply in Southeast Asia. Even in the Islamic areas of Malaya, Indonesia, and the southern Philippines. Elsewhere, the women's primary task was to marry and raise children, especially boys, and they were regarded as the property of their husbands, a view reinforced by the Quran. The Quran was used explicitly to legitimize the subordination of women. This point was succinctly started by a 7th century Iranian theologian who asserted that a wife's principal spiritual duty was subservience to her husband's. So, as early as the 1200s, Islamic society was characterized by a separate social life for men and women. This is a picture of a strong woman in China, Mulan. I also post a song, a folk song of a folklore of Mulan on UB Learns. Please read that. So at the end, this is a picture of a beautiful shoes of the 3-inch golden lattice fit in China. You can see how small the shoes were. Okay, so today's session is over. Thank you very much.